Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Markmonitor ICANN recap webinar. Today, we're going to be going over the highs and the lows of ICANN 77, the policy meeting that was held in Washington, D.C. Thank you so much for joining us. We're really excited to give you the recap today. And introducing our hosts today are members of the industry relations team at Markmonitor. I'm Prudence Malinky. I head up the industry relations team at Markmonitor. I've been at Markmonitor for close to a decade, and I deal with all things compliance, policy, and industry relation all over the globe. I will be joined today by other members of the industry relations team, starting with Shane Lehman. He's our resident expert of all things to do with gTLD relationships and also all things to do with NFT and Web3. And I will also be joined by someone who you may or may not recognize. We have Chris Numi joining us today. Chris is also the newest addition to the industry relations team, and he is our resident expert who deals in all things to do with .brand and the next round or subsequent procedures as it's known in the ICANN world. He'll be giving you an update relating to the timeline with regards to subsequent procedures, and also he'll be providing the GAC update. And Shane will also be providing an update relating to all things ccNSO as well. We have an action-packed agenda for you today, which I'm really excited to share shortly. And we've had a really interesting couple of days with this policy meeting, so we're really excited to give you this recap and all of the latest developments. Today, as I've mentioned before, we have an action-packed agenda. Although the policy meeting was a mere 4 days, there was not a dull moment. We have a number of sessions that we're going to be going over with you today, including the IDM PDP update. We'll also be taking a deep dive with regard to ccNSO and their policy developments as well. We'll also be giving you an introduction into the RDRS system. We'll be talking all things DNS abuse amendments and giving you a run through of where we are with those. We'll touch on the registration data policies IRT and the work happening there. But I know what everyone's very keen to know about. We'll also be providing an update relating to the timeline with subsequent procedures, or subpro as the cool kids used to call it. There's an update relating to WIPO and Handshake domains that we'll go over too. And obviously I'll be doing a deep dive in this session relating to the transfer PDP, where we are and what the proposed amendments and changes have been for transfers as well, because this will impact how we conduct transfers moving forward. And then we're going to wrap everything up today with an update relating to the developments with our new CEO of ICANN, or lack thereof. But yes, we have a really action-packed agenda for you. And without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Shane, who's going to give you the meeting at a glance. Shane?
All right, let's jump right in. ICANN 77 was held in Washington, D.C., which is a major contrast compared to Cancun, and a lot quieter for those that attended Cancun. As a 4-day meeting with a focus on policy, with a full agenda, including GAC sessions, sub-pro IRT registration policy sessions, my favorite, ccNSO sessions, which you'll hear me talk about later, IPC and DC sessions, all taking place during the week. As this was my first ICANN policy meeting, the number of participants blew me away. We had 1,156 in-person attendees. That's including ICANN board, ICANN staff, and support staff. Of the total 1,786 total registered attendees, 630 of them were virtual participants. Some of the regional breakdowns blew me away. 82 participants from Africa, 143 participants from the APAC region. Europe had 227 participants. Latin America and the Caribbean, 73 participants, with North America rounding it out with 612 participants. So all in all, just a solid turnout from around the globe. The meeting schedule focused primarily on multi-stakeholder group policy work and outreach. Some super interesting cross-community topics were DNS abuse negotiation, contracted parties house outreach session, the GDS subsequent procedures implementation recommendation team, the GNSO EPDP phase 2 small team system for standardized access and disclosure, implementation of registration data request service, or as we like to call it, RDRS, ALAC, GAC, and gNSO facilitated dialogue on closed generics. And if you aren't done with acronyms yet, don't worry, there'll be more. Overall, it was an exciting meeting. It's wonderful to see the industry come together like this. From the various sessions per day and after work drinks, the session had it all, with a lot of developments and news to follow. However, we would be remiss if we didn't take a moment to pay respect to Pam Little, who recently passed away. There were so many touching tributes during this ICANN meeting, and Pam was a mentor to our own Heidi Zhang on our team. So we'd like to pay our respects to Pam, who was a true force and inspiration in the ICANN community, and whose presence, support, and contribution shall be sorely missed. So the EPDP started what feels like way back in August 2021, which was really only 2 years ago. And it takes input from multiple groups: the country code name supporting organization, the generic name supporting organization, the registry stakeholder group, and the Security and Stability Advisory Committee. There were 68 preliminary recommendations covering issues pertaining to gTLD variant definition and management at the top level. And a lot of recommendations were relating with the name to operate with sub-pro PDP outputs to allow for future application of gTLD variant labels through the new gTLD program. There are 2 phases to the EPDP that you need to know. One being the IDN gTLD definition and variant management, and the other being the second level IDN variant management. Some of the big outcomes from these sessions were defining the domain lifecycle as it relates to the same entity concept, which is essentially where the same entity is the registrant for all IDN variants of the gTLD, and all IDN variants are tied to the root gTLD registration, meaning all domain variants transfer with the domain. And finally, any deletion of a domain causes the IDN domain to be reserved for the holder of the variant that exists. The Phase 1 report came out in April, with the EPDP group working through Phase 2 currently. And now I'll kick it over to the wonderful Prudence Malinke. Thanks.
Okay, so let's discuss all things RDRS. Now, before you ask, what is RDRS? But before I go into that, let's set a little bit of context and set the scene. Now, before RDRS, there was another 4 letters, the SSAD. Now, that stands for the System for Standard Access and Disclosure. Now, this system was the pre-RDRS system that was designed to provide a central repository for handling requests for non-public registration data. Now, there was something known as the ODA, or the Operational Design Assessment. Now, the ODA actually highlighted a number of issues with the SSAD, which is what has been led to the creation of the RDRS. Now, the RDRS is the Registration Data Request Service. Some people are calling it Red Dress, which is a kind of very catchy name. I like to call it Red Dress myself, as a fan of brightly coloured dresses. Now, the Red Dress system, as you can tell from the slide, it's a ticketing system to allow registrars to receive requests relating to registrant data. Now, these requests will be coming not just from other registrars, but registrants, law enforcement agencies, any other party who needs access to non-public registration data. Now, the RDRS system, the way that it's designed is it will allow you to submit the request, but the RDRS will not give the data nor make that determination. That will still be within the harms and within the scope of the registrar. So the system will just allow you to receive the request, or make the request, or send the request. The registrar will still make that determination as to whether the registrant data should be provided, and the registrar should be able to utilize their own mechanisms for delivering that data should they be eligible to receive it. So the RDRS system is in its infancy, so it's brand new, and we're going to really need to have a level of engagement. So we've seen a lot of outreach, and we're at the early stages regarding outreach and engagement levels. And because there's no actual obligation to use the system, so there is a fear of a lack of engagement. And what we've actually seen, which is really fantastic, is that the CSG and the CPH have come together to try and conduct high-level discussions to deal with education pieces to help with regards to making sure that law enforcement and other elements know about RDRS and also how to utilize it to the best efforts and to the best interest as well. So this is like a really great time, and we're seeing a lot of potential discussions and collaboration, and potentially, we're seeing this multi stakeholder model really come together, which is fantastic. Now, it's still early days. So we've literally just had the ticketing system be built earlier this month. In May, there was a number of webinars that were held with regards to RDRS. But what we're looking at is the end of November is the rough time frame for go live. And we know that there are concerns relating to bulk requests. And we know that roughly around August time, maybe the end of August, we'll be looking at the bulk request system, and we'll be looking at like reviewing from the registrar side how bulk requests will be handled at all. But again, it's very, very early days, and it's a really exciting time. So we're really actively going to be seeing a lot of participation being encouraged, especially seeing this system isn't mandatory. So in order for the success of the system, we really need to make sure that people are using it. So if you have any questions about RDRS, please do reach out to your DPA and let them know.
All right. I'd like to start by acknowledging that the ccNSO is celebrating its 20th year anniversary, a wonderful achievement for the ccTLD community, especially considering that this organization was established in 2003. To jump in, let's start talking about some pre and post-pandemic registration trends, which I know is not the easiest thing to talk about, but let's get into it. Some of the data trends on ccTLD registrations showed that in 2017, there were 339 million ccTLD registrations compared to 375 million in 2023. Let's pick a particular ccTLD to talk about. The one I'm going to choose is TWNIC, which is the registry operator for .tw, which saw consistent registration and renewal rates through the pandemic due to companies shifting their focus to online e-commerce sites. This is a trend that is apparent in most ccTLDs as companies shift their focus to being more online. Next up, let's move into the DASC, or the DNS Abuse Subcommittee. I did warn you about all the acronyms. The DNS Abuse Subcommittee has launched its repository to give resources and mitigation tools to ccTLD registry operators in order to combat DNS abuse. This repository initially will be open to ccTLD registry operators, with registrars gaining full access once it's fully built out. Moving on, let's talk about a few new and exciting technologies for expanded ccTLD reach. We have South Africa.ca has implemented EPP adoption to accredit more registrars. Not to be outdone, Portugal.pt has started using AI, which is vastly popular right now, to help with registration validations for their ccTLDs. Next up, we have the IDN ccTLD policy development session, which is a policy proposal which outlines that an IDN ccTLD string must be associated with a territory, meaning it must have a meaningful representation of the name of a territory in a designated language and a related script, and only one IDN string can be allocated per designated language, which is a major development in IDN string management and avoidance of confusion within the industry. As a registrar, we see that far too often. So these are some of the major updates from ICANN 77 and the ccNSO. I'll now shoot it over to Chris, who's going to have a fun talk about DNS abuse amendment.
While it wasn't quite East Coast summer hot in DC quite yet, DNS abuse was a hot topic at ICANN 77, mentioned specifically as a headlining subject in two main sessions. Work started in the contracted party house in January has us moving down the football field and may result in DNS amendment wording getting over the goal line, which may end up being added to both the registrar accreditation agreement for registrars and to the registry agreement for registries. From a registrar perspective, this wording is a major change for us. It means that abuse contacts must be accessible on our websites, and registrars must give confirmation of receipt of submitted abuse reports. It also pivots us to a very technical definition of DNS abuse. There will be a bit more on this definition later. Right now, this defines it as malware, botnets, phishing, farming, and spam when it's a delivery mechanism for one of the other four types. This change moves us from a investigate and respond concept to more of a taking a mitigating action concept. So there's a real sense of a requirement for action on behalf of registrars. Our goal now is to focus on how to stop or disrupt the use of an abused domain name, just like when you're trying to break up an opposing team's game plan. These amendments allow for a web form format as well for the abuse report intake mechanism, so there were lots of discussions related to that in the sessions. An advisory was also created with expectations and explanations of how compliance and working examples of abuse could be really tackled, like a running back for the Washington Commanders. So where are we now? DNS abuse is a complex problem that's very difficult to solve. But with these agreements in place, we believe that this is a good start in encouraging registries and registrars to have a bias for action in this area. As shown on the timeline on the slide, there's work to be done in regard to getting these amendments into effect, including voting by both the registrars and the registries about their respective agreements, board consideration, and finally implementation. If the amendments are approved, we can consider that a touchdown for the industry. There will likely be additional policy work, including additional PDPs to follow. This is an important issue to watch, as it can lead to more actions of consequence taken by registrars and registries in relation to DNS abuse, for providing meaningful supporting evidence in abuse request submissions, and more engagement in the community as the contracted parties work together around this issue. Also, for additional information on DNS abuse, please see information put out by the DNS abuse detectives over at DNS Research Federation and the DNS Abuse Institute, as well as check out the tools like NetBeacon and AssetTool.com that can help with your very own DNS abuse private investigations and reporting.
Now, we cannot talk about DNS abuse without mentioning recent developments that are hot off the press from the last inter-AGM meeting held in Singapore in May. Now, during that meeting, a brand new definition of DNS abuse was circulated and passed as a motion. Now, you can see the definition provided on this slide. Now, for those of you who are familiar with the technical definition of DNS abuse, you will note that this definition is very different. There's no specific reference to any of the technical abuse elements, and it seems to be worded in a broader scope. So this is a very exciting development that has happened, and we cannot mention the DNS abuse amendments without mentioning the developments that are happening with the IP community, which are very exciting. Now, the question does become of what does this mean, and how does this impact anything at ICANN? And this is very early days. So we do not really know the actual lasting impact of this new definition provided at Inter. However, what we do know is that the way that this is worded, it's broadly enough constructed to incorporate things such as an IP infringement or intellectual property infringement. And also as well, we are guessing that this is going to be, or start being more socialized and circulated during ICANN meetings. Whether it gains traction with regards to ICANN, this is too early to say. However, keep your eyes peeled. You're not going to hear the end of this new inter-DNS abuse definition. So during this ICANN meeting, we did have the Registration Data Policy IRT come together and held a session. Now, before I dive into what happened during that session, I'll set the scene and provide a bit of context. Let me talk a little bit more about implementation review teams, or IRTs. You'll hear the word IRT banded around a lot. Basically, it stands for Implementation Review Teams. And the purpose of an implementation review team, they're designed to assist with, guess what? implementation. Now, essentially, the implementation details for the board and approved policy development that happened within gNSO PDP working groups. So essentially, see it as the follow-up work from a PDP where you try and figure out how does this get implemented and how does that work and what does that implementation look like. Now, with regards to the registration data policy IRT, this was started back in 2019. That's when they essentially started working this IRT group. And in 2021, in June around, the board adopted the phase 2 recommendations relating to this IRT. Now, we actually found that there were 34 recommendations that were analysed to determine the implementation tasks relating to EPDP phase 1 back in the day, and that's around 29 from phase 1, around 4 from phase 2, and there was 1 additional supplemental recommendation. Now, the draft registration data policy language has been published for public comment at this time. Now, at the actual ICANN meeting, this was a working session. So they actually went through specific documents and we were joined by members of the IRT group, but also Dennis Chang from ICANN.org was there leading the session. Now, the session and documents that they reviewed specifically in that session, you can see on this slide, but they include the RDAP response profile. They also include the Uniform Rapid Suspension System, or URS system. And then it also went over the URS high-level technical requirements for registries and registrars. So it was a really productive session with regards to proceeding and kind of approving documents, because they reviewed all of these documents and kind of completed them through. And just to provide a little bit more context, there were documents that were actually deemed as not impacted, so they aren't under review, such as the AGB policy, the registry services evaluation policy, and the expired domain deletion policy as well. But again, it was a really interesting session that they went through with all of these documents, and there's going to be more work for them to follow. So on this slide, you can see the timeline relating to the registration data policy IRT work. And as you can see from this slide, they have an end date that's looking at 2025, when they're hoping that the IRT wraps up and that we actually are looking at the implementation being complete for the policy work here. And what that essentially means is that by 2025, they're hoping that all of the contracted parties are actually complying with the registration data policy in and of itself. So that's all listed there. Will they reach 2025? I actually think they may do, because they've actually been relatively efficient, all things considered. So I'm actually this is looking actually quite realistic. And this actually could be famous last words. But we'll keep you posted with more development.
New gTLDs continue to be a popular subject at ICANN 77, which brings us to the subsequent procedures IRT. To take a moment to level set, let's jump in the TARDIS and go back in time to December 17th, 2015. The gNSO Council had initiated a policy development process and chartered the new gTLD Subsequent Procedures Working Group, which was tasked with determining what changes should be made to the new gTLD program. Now, like the doctor, let's jump forward to March 16th of this year, when the ICANN board passed a resolution on a set of recommendations from the final report in the new gTLD Subsequent Procedures Policy Development Process, which directed ICANN.org to begin the implementation phase of this report's outputs. Then on April 5th, ICANN called for volunteers for the new gTLD program Next Round Implementation Review Team, and the team began meeting on May 16th. The outcome of the team's work will be an updated applicant guidebook for use in the next round. As you can see, there are still a number of dependencies that need to happen, including resolution of the 38 pending recommendations from the final report, completing both the closed generics and internationalized domain name EPDPs, completing the GGP for applicant support, and publishing the NCAP2 study. Taking these estimates into account, this results in an approximate May 2025 IRT completion date. Taking all of these dependencies into account, ICANN created this chart of the parallel workflows. As you can see, it is following what they've called a 2 + 1 = 3 model. That is roughly 2 years for the full completion of the IRT, which will again result in the creation of a new applicant guidebook, and then an additional year for all the development and testing and operationalization of the various systems that will need to be involved to run the application window of the program. Adding these together gets us to a roughly 3-year expectation of a next round. The obvious key takeaway from this is that we're 3 years away from a next round. ICANN is committed to providing actual dates on this timeline when they deliver their August 1st deliverable. When this announcement was made on the first day of ICANN 77, realistically, it was met with some disappointment and some questioning in the room. But I do think it seemed to add some gravity to the remainder of the week, as people were now aware of what was needed in order to complete the work, and they did the sessions accordingly. With that said, we'll keep you posted as this estimate is subject to change, though if you can get Dr. Who to take you to 2026 right now, please let me know.
As Prudence mentioned, I work heavily in Web3 and NFT domains here at Markmonitor, and wouldn't be right if I didn't get a small window to talk about Web3. Some big news came out during ICANN regarding Web3 development, which essentially could be the first rights protection mechanisms created in Web3. Handshake, or HNS, is a decentralized naming protocol that allows for the accessibility to NFT domains and strings in the Web3 space. As trends in Web3 are showing, more decentralized organizations are moving towards working with a centralized organization, such as the World Intellectual Property Organization, or WIPO. Announced during the IPC meeting, Namebase, who is an operator of the Handshake protocol, is voluntarily adopting the UDRP for trademark disputes in their particular alternate routes. So it seems this could be some of the first rights protection mechanisms in Web3 to enable trademark holders and well-known brands to engage in UDRPs and URS in the decentralized web. While this process is still being outlined, Markmonitor will continue to engage in these developments to ensure our clients are prepared and up to date on any major news and developments. From a policy standpoint, and in my opinion, this could be a major step in creating a precedent that the rest of Web3 follows in order to gain more adoption from clients like ours in this space. And if you'd like to learn more about Web3 and how Markmonitor can help, please contact your domain portfolio advisor and let's set up some time to talk. Thanks.
So, at the ICANN 77 meeting held in Washington, D.C., we talked all things transfer PDP. Now, before I talk about what we talked about in the session, which is roughly on the slides here, I want to do a recap with you and give you an explanation as to where we are now and what recommendations have come out so far from this PDP. Now, the reason why I want to give you this overview is because essentially this PDP is going to be responsible for changing the way that we conduct registrar to registrar transfers of domains for all gTLDs moving forward. And it is that dramatic because it is that important. It's one of the fundamental elements of day-to-day domain management. And in order to make sure that it works, this PDP is going to be refining those processes. So it'll be really great to bring you all up to speed with where we are and where we've been and hopefully where we're going to go. So this PDP group, which I won't lie, I am also a part of, it started back in May 2021. Now, basically, this started as a result of GDPR highlighting that certain elements to do with transfer processes were no longer functional due to the restrictions with registrant data from what was known as the WHOIS database. Now, as a result, we had to do an overhaul and re-look at the entire transfer processes to see where we are and see whether it's fit for purpose and also make efficiencies. So what I'll be explaining today is some of those efficiencies and what they look like and talking you through them. Now, one of the biggest changes from this PDP specifically is that you'll notice that no one's using the word auth code or transfer auth code or authorization code. These terms are now defunct and the authorization code has now been replaced with the term, or the auth code has now been replaced with the term TAC. Now, the TAC or the TAC code stands for the Transfer Authorization Code, and it's being defined as an actual token created by the registrar and provided upon request to the registered name holder to facilitate a transfer. And so we actually have a brand new terminology to use and to define how we facilitate a transfer code using that TAC. So we also have a number of additional recommendations that have come through as a result of the PDP so far. And some of these recommendations include things such as eliminating a losing FOA. So the form of authorization, which was a mandatory element of a transfer before that was sent from the losing registrar to the gaining registrar, that has actually now been eliminated. And again, this is all flowing from, you guessed it, GDPR legislation. Also, as well, we actually have incorporated a recommendation from this group that a notification of TAC provision is actually going to be sent to the registered name holder. So this is something that's relatively new. So we're actually going to be making sure that the notification goes to the holder saying that the transfer code has been required or sent over to them. This notification will also provide the domain name, the date, but also the time that the TAC was provided as well, and when the TAC will expire. So all of that information will be sent to the registered name holder, and it will also contain instructions as to how the registered name holder can take action if the request isn't legitimate or they believe that the request was done in error. So that communication as well can also contain that transfer code. So this is like a brand new kind of thing that we'll be kind of looking at that we didn't have before. So again, we're talking about TTLs, and we've kind of gone into the real technical elements relating to transfers. So the TTL for the TAC must be 14 calendar days from the time it's set at the registry, but it can also be set to null after 14 days, but it has to be by agreement by the registrar and the registered name holder. So that's another development that's happened directly out of this PDP. So because we already know that the admin contact is no longer there, we've also made recommendations to remove references to admin contact and just replace it with things such as the registered name holder where appropriate, because we're no longer collecting admin contact information. Now, here's the fun bit. So post-transfer and post-registration restrictions relating to transfers, originally these locks to prevent you from transferring were originally 60-day locks. So you'll remember when you first register a domain name or when you first transfer a domain name, you're prevented from transferring again or creating a second transfer or doing your first transfer for a period of 60 days. This has now been recommended to be reduced down to 30 days, which is again a very exciting development. So these are like just a high-level overview of some of the changes and some of the recommendations that have been coming through from this PDP group so far. And again, one of the reasons why I'm emphasizing this so much is because this genuinely will impact and change how we do transfers. And transfers are really, truly a fundamental part of domain portfolio management. So it's really good that you guys are kept up to speed with regards to what's happening there. Now, during the ICANN meeting, we actually weren't talking about the transfer process necessarily itself. We were focused on the TEAC, which is the Transfer Emergency Action Contact, and the TDRP, which again is the Transfer Dispute Resolution Policy. So we were kind of focusing on speaking about that and actually going over with regards to proposals as to changes and actually talking about whether, especially things such as the TDRP, whether these are fit for purpose or whether, the communication needs to be revised and things of that nature. So we were actually really looking at the preliminary findings to do with whether these services work or whether there should be any changes that were made. And it was a really helpful session with regards to just keeping everyone up to speed with regards to the TDRP and also the TEAC as well. So as you can see from this slide that we have here, the original TEAC process there's an obligation to respond within a 4-hour period. So the TEAC is a very special emergency registrar to registrar process to allow an emergency correspondence between two registrars in the event of a transfer. And there's an obligation to provide a response within a 4-hour time window because of just how urgent the TEAC process is. Now, the recommendation that we're putting out from the team is that we actually extend that out to 24 hours or 1 day with a discretion as to how we communicate that response. But it was noted that we should probably try and make sure that the initial communication is via email. But yes, so this is like a high-level overview relating to where we are with regards to the transfer PDP. There's still going to be much more work to go through. And again, I really would suggest that you take a look at the recommendations that have come out earlier this month. And they are all available online, so you can have a look and have a read through there. Because the public comment was released, I think, back this month in June 2023, and it covers the FOAs, the info codes, and also NACking transfers as well.
Before we get into the actions of the GAC and its activities in ICANN 77, let's get out our pencils and rulers and have a quick refresher on what the GAC actually is. The GAC is the Governmental Advisory Committee, which constitutes the voice of governments and intergovernmental organizations in ICANN's multi-stakeholder model. The GAC was established in 1999 in parallel with ICANN's first public meetings and has operated continuously since. The GAC is an advisory committee to the ICANN board. Its key role is to provide advice to ICANN on issues of public policy, especially where there may be an intersection between ICANN activities or policies and national laws or international agreements. Per ICANN bylaws, GAC advice must be taken into account by the ICANN board, and where the board proposes actions inconsistent with GAC advice, it must give reasons for doing so and attempt to reach a mutually acceptable solution. Now that we've caught up on the purpose of the GAC, it becomes clear that the GAC was busy in Washington, D.C., as it held meetings with the ICANN board, the ALAC, and the gNSO, and also took part in cross-community discussions. Its subgroup, the Public Safety Working Group, put on its own hard hat and went to work too, holding a capacity development workshop on DNS abuse, briefing the GAC on DNS abuse mitigation, as well as participating in a GAC small group update. Likewise, the Underserved Regions Working Group also used some elbow grease of its own in holding a capacity development workshop on Sunday prior to the Policy Forum's official opening about proposed RA and RAA amendments. Many issues in the ICANN community are of importance to the GAC, as shown on this list. That said, the GAC met with the board and continued to lay the foundations on 5 points regarding the new gTLD subsequent rounds, including equitable participation in the proposed Standing Predictability Implementation Review Team, or SPIRIT, by all communities, having future registry voluntary commitments and public interest commitments be enforceable through clear contractual obligations with specific consequences, asking ICANN to specify plans to expand applicant support in underrepresented and underserved regions by the next ICANN meeting, ICANN 78, asked for the reduction or elimination of fees for underrepresented and underserved applicants, and sought facilitation of global diversification in the new gTLD program. The GAC early warnings and GAC advice also were echoed to be important and useful instruments to identify applications that raise public policy concerns, with the GAC being open to dialoguing with applicants about having those concerns addressed. The GAC also sought to avoid use of auctions of last resort and contention sets between commercial and non-commercial applications, and to ban or strongly disincentivize private auctions use overall. One point of interest was that this was Nicolas Caballero's first ICANN meeting as the GAC chair. He's the first Latin American representative to hold that position. On the last day of the forum, he received applause from the GAC floor for his leadership throughout all the sessions, which reflected the relatively positive, if not upbeat, week of policy work that I witnessed. Overall, our takeaway is the GAC still has the new gTLD program in front of mind. Taking into account the consensus advice they provided, as well as the lurking specter of closed generics, we will continue to watch the GALAX policy work, as it will have wide-ranging impacts across the new gTLD program. The GALAX interest in DNS abuse and emerging technologies is also an important barometer on other issues that continue to be at the forefront of community interest.
Now, I couldn't give you an ICANN recap webinar without talking about the stuff that's happening in the background. As you all know, or may not know, back in December 2022, Joran Malby, the former CEO of ICANN, had to step down from his position as a result of ongoing health issues. And as a result, we have had an interim CEO. Her name is Sally Costerton, fellow Brit, and also a lady with extensive experience. I believe she was the ICANN senior advisor to the president, and also I think she held the position of the vice president of global stakeholder engagement as well. So a lot of extensive experience. However, she's the interim CEO, and that means that the search for the new CEO of ICANN is still underway. And we had an update relating to the search and what the qualities are that we are looking for in a new fearless leader, and also, what the key responsibilities look like. This session was absolutely fascinating because the word unicorn was bandied around a lot. And there was a lot of discussion about the attributes that the CEO must have that people weren't aware of, such as they need to be able to be bilingual, at least bilingual, or have discipline in at least 2 languages. But you may not have known that. So fluency in English is not sufficient to hold the role of CEO. Now, on this slide, you can see here the ICANN CEO Search Committee. Now, the members and the names and the faces that you see on this side mean that they are not eligible to put themselves up for CEO. Which is kind of shame, nice to see maybe Becky take the reign potentially. But, these are going to be the parties that will be participating in the search committee, but also just please do note, as per the slide, board members are not directly involved in the search, and also Sally herself is also not involved in the search. There's been a lot of extensive listening sessions that have been conducted, and we're looking at a timeline of February 2024 for interviews for the prospective candidates with the ICANN board. So this is all things moving forward. Now, to give you some visibility as to what key responsibilities will be necessary for the new CEO, the CEO will be looking at IANA functional management. They also need to be looking at obviously policy development and implementation, as well as new gTLD program management and strategic management and community engagement and organizational management and accountability management, as well as being the organization's spokesperson. So there's a lot that is required in order to take up this role. So this search is going to be ongoing, and we will keep you updated with regards to all of the developments relating to the CEO search. But whilst in the forefront and at the front, we have all of our policy development that's happening, all of our meetings and sessions that are happening. Always please note that at the background, there's this search for the CEO, and it is on. So we will be keeping you updated with regards to all of the developments relating to that. But as mentioned in the session and the update session, we may be looking for an elusive unicorn. There's a reason why they're called unicorns. We may need to find someone who's a compromise. So it will be very interesting to see what happens next. ICANN is not only is this something for you to observe from the sidelines, we always encourage and implore you to get involved. On this slide, you can see the myriad of ways that you can engage with ICANN, and one of the things we would strongly suggest and advise that you do is join one of these groups and engage with the community and also get involved in making meaningful change in policy. We are obviously here to help you do that, and we're obviously here to do this for you, but we always will suggest and implore and encourage you to get involved. It's actually a lovely community, and it really is a fantastic way to learn more about what's happening in the sector, but also as well to affect meaningful change, to affect how you conduct yourself with regards to the domain name ecosystem. So this concludes our ICANN 77 recap webinar. There was an action-packed 4 days, and we're really looking forward to the next meeting, which will be held in October, the AGM, the annual general meeting, and that's going to be in Hamburg, Germany. Now, obviously, we will happily have you come with us and participate with us, but we'll be providing another recap webinar of all of the latest developments to do with all things ICANN. Now, please do feel free, if you have any questions at all about anything that's been raised in the webinar today, please reach out to your DPA and ask and request any additional. That concludes the ICANN recap webinar for ICANN 77 in Washington, DC. It's been a fantastic policy meeting, and I really hope that the updates have been really helpful to you. Thank you so much for taking the time to participate and listen to our webinar, and I really look forward to presenting our AGM recap for October this year. Thanks, everyone. Take care. Bye.